Welcome, everybody. We're so excited to be studying this crucially important topic with Dr. Elana Stein Hain and over 600 live participants from all over the world. We'll be taught today by Dr. Elana Stein Hain, who is the Scholar in Residence and Director of Faculty here at the Shalom Hartman Institute of North America. Elana also leads our Created Equal research team, a team of scholars who meet weekly to research issues of gender and ethical leadership in the Jewish tradition. The Me Too movement has brought increasing awareness of sexual violence and discrimination faced by women in the workplace and beyond to the fore. Among the multitude of important questions this awareness raises, as a Created Equal research team, we have turned our attention to the ways, both positive and negative, in which the Jewish tradition intersects with these issues. Today's webinar will be the first of a three-part series of presentations resulting from our work, which will go on to focus on images of the feminine and masculine in the Jewish tradition and how these cultural heritages impact our community as it confronts Me Too. Today, Elana will focus on questions of how and whether we can turn to our Jewish textual heritage for guidance as we address sexual violence, recognizing as we do both the wisdom of that tradition and its deeply patriarchal nature. How do we learn from Jewish texts written exclusively by men for primarily an audience of men in the moment of Me Too? Following Elana's presentation, we'll have a period of Q&A. For those of you watching live, you can contribute questions on the Shalom Hartman Facebook page. And with that, Dr. Elana Stein Hain.
Thank you so much, Sarah. We're really happy that people have joined us for this important conversation. And I have to start with actually two verses from the psalmist that really, for me, frame this whole conversation. The first is, Ma ahavti Toratecha kol hayom hi sichati. How I have loved your teaching, or am loyal to your teaching, all day it is my conversation and my meditation. I really come to this conversation about male privilege in the Jewish tradition as a person who feels a privilege to be able to study Torah each and every day, to be able to shape my views about the world, my relationship with God, my relationship with human beings, with fellow Jews, and with myself by the Torah that I am privileged to learn. The second verse, the second pasuk that I'd like to bring to bear in our conversation today is another from the psalmist from the very same chapter. Lulei Toratcha sha'ashu'ai az avadati ba'onyi. If not for the Torah having been my delight, or literally if not for your teaching having been my delight, I would have perished in my own suffering. And that's important too to the conversation that I'm going to have today. Torah for me has always been a source of strength, has gotten me through really important, difficult moments in my life and challenges, and I wouldn't be anywhere without it. And so it's with these two psukim, with these two verses on my mind, as I think the humility that we need in looking at a corpus that has shaped a people, that has shaped society and civilizations, that has a commanding ability and a compelling sense of justice and ritual and what the meaning of life really is, to ask this question with the humility that is required by this question and the humility that is required by what we are seeking to address. With that in mind, I'd like to ask the following question. How does a 2017 modern human being, a reader of the Jewish canon, respond to the male privilege that is inscribed in the Jewish canon? Let's define our terms. I'm specifically talking about a reader. I'm not talking about behavior. I'm not talking about the way that people enact their Judaism. I'm specifically talking about the way a person who opens up a book of the Bible, of the Tanakh, who opens up a Talmud, responds to its male privilege. The reason why I'm doing this is because no matter how unegalitarian or egalitarian a Jewish life you lead, we all open those same texts. And those same texts, actually what unites us across those spectra, those same texts have that male privilege that all of us have to encounter, no matter how liberal or conservative we are. What do I mean by the Jewish canon? What I mean by the Jewish canon is the Bible, is the Tanakh. What I mean by the Jewish canon is the Talmud, is early rabbinic literature, and then the 1,500 years of explanation of that rabbinic literature. What I mean by male privilege. Generally speaking, our canon, those 2,000 years of interpretation, that original Talmud, that original Bible that precedes those 2,000 years of interpretation, is really taught, spoken from the perspective of men, or is speaking to men primarily. Now, how do I, as a woman who considers these texts sacred and compelling to me, how do I understand and respond to this male privilege? The theologian Judith Plaskow puts it very succinctly, and you have this on your source sheet as number 1. Like women in many cultures, Jewish women have been projected as other. Named by a male community that perceives itself as normative, women are part of the Jewish tradition without its sources and its structures reflecting our experience. Women are Jews, but we do not define Jewishness. And I would add in parentheses, even if in certain ways we do, in so many ways we don't. We live, work, and struggle, but our experiences are not recorded, and what is recorded is formulating our experiences in male terms. Before we move into what I would call a taxonomy of different approaches to responding to male privilege in Jewish tradition, I want to talk for a moment about why this matters. I can think of at least 3 reasons why this matters, and I'd imagine that those viewing have their own reasons for being interested in this conversation. The first is, as a person of faith, I really need our sacred canon to be relevant. I really need it to be able to speak to a 21st century person. I really need it to reflect the values that can be in dialogue with today's world. Secondly, for anyone who puts Jewish text as central, whether in the education of our young people, in our adult education spaces, in the way that we formulate the ideas that we want to live by, we have to understand that we hope that Torah, that the Jewish canon, that Jewish text will actually shape our assumptions and our perspectives about the world. And if that is true, and I do hope that that will continue to be true, then the male privilege of that tradition must be addressed and must be discussed, because that too continues to shape our assumptions and our perspectives. And the third is this Me Too moment. You may have noticed a spate of articles that try to respond to the Me Too moment by asking what Jewish tradition has to say to Me Too, and the criticism that came in the wake of those articles. And what I realize is we should really take a step back, because what we have to realize is that anybody who writes an article about how Judaism can respond to Me Too, in some way, whether implicitly or explicitly, is likely trying to think about the question of how we look at an actual canon and tradition that does see male orientation as the default orientation, in order to speak to a moment where we're actually criticizing that kind of male privilege. And so this warranted, I think, an ability to take a look at some of those Me Too responses and say, well, what's going on here implicitly with regards to trying to understand Jewish tradition, the modern world, and male privilege? Tova Hartman, in her book, Feminism Encounters Traditional Judaism, posits 3 different approaches that a person might take towards male privilege in Jewish tradition. There's affirmation on one side of the spectrum, which essentially says this is the way that it's meant to be. And there are plenty of people in the Jewish world and beyond for whom affirmation is a very comfortable place. And I'd like to argue as a feminist, that this too is a form of agency that I can't take away from anyone. On the other end of the spectrum is rejection. People who say, I want to go in a radically different direction. I can't be bound by this. And so I'm going to fight against this, as opposed to being in dialogue with it as equal dialogical partners. I'm going in a different direction. This too is an act of agency. That said, I'd like to locate our conversation in her middle category, reinterpretation. The middle category is for people who feel a need and a desire to converse with these texts, to be held by these texts, and also to figure out how these texts can continue to, shall we say, continue to provide real, deep conversation around the issues that matter to us most today. And so our taxonomy. I'm going to give you a brief overview, and then we're going to dive into each one separately. The four are the following. The first is dualism. It's a dualistic approach that essentially says God and human beings are different. While God is perfect in God's desire for equity and God's desire for fairness and people to be treated and perspectives to be represented from all different sides of the human experience, human beings are flawed. And quite simply, it takes human beings a very long time to get there. This is the God of liberation theology, not the God that reifies the power structures that exist, but the God that seeks to help the marginalized and the oppressed gain the voice that they need. And what we've seen reflected in 2,000 years is human beings' continued evolution into understanding what might be a divine perspective. The second approach is a tool from within tradition itself. I call this the Midrashic approach. Midrash, or homiletics, essentially posits that you can reinterpret, that you can reappropriate traditional themes and texts to continue a conversation between the lines. This approach, we'll see, actually has two very opposing ways that it could go. But the Midrashic approach, what's lovely about it, in my perspective, is that it's found in the tradition itself. We have books and books of Midrashic work. And here, the feminist Midrash would essentially be asking the question, yes, our texts do offer a male perspective, but how can we continue the conversation and reinterpret in order to have female perspectives in the frame as well? The third approach I call precedent. Now, it's not really a legal approach, but I do think that it comes from a legal perspective and a legal way of thinking, which is to say, just find an example in Jewish tradition, in Torah, that highlights empowered women, or that highlights a perspective of a woman as an active agent, or simply her perspective at all. And take those moments and name them as the bright spots. Name them as the bright spots that can be expanded, that can serve as an example for ways in which Torah and the Jewish canon already contains our ability to be the modern day, what we might call the modern day Devora, the judge, or the modern day Yalta, or Bruria, the Talmudic scholars and sages, or even what the mystical tradition adds in terms of viewing God, viewing the divine, both with masculine and feminine aspects. Take those examples and seize upon them. The fourth in our categories is redefinition. Very simply, if the Torah throughout history has been speaking to the default human being, while the default human being used to be male, the default human being today includes more than men. And so the Torah was speaking to a certain group and now is speaking to everyone. Now let's examine each. What I want you to keep in mind, though, is that as we read examples of each of these approaches, it's not the example that I'm interested in. It's the assumptions and the contours of each one of these categories that's much more important than the particular example that we offer. And so with that, let's dive in. If you'll go with me together to number 3 on your source sheet, what you'll see is an example of the dualistic approach, God versus human being. We see this approach nowhere else but in the rabbinic canon itself. Remarkably, an early rabbinic text describing the story of the daughters of Tzlafchad in Bamidbar, in Numbers, discusses just this very dualism, the difference between human beings and God when it comes to gender equity. To remind us, the 5 daughters of Tzlafchad find themselves in the wilderness with the rest of the Jewish people, dismayed to learn that they have no brothers, and therefore their father's land is not going to be kept in their immediate family. And so they go to Moses and they say to Moses, Moshe, can you please ask a question? Can you please answer our question? What should we do here? Our father has had no sons. Can we please inherit as his daughters? Can we please inherit his land? Just look at what the rabbis do here. A self-reflectiveness that is remarkable for something written over 1,500 years ago. We're in number 3. I'm going to read it in the Hebrew and translate. Vatikravna benot Tzlofchad. The daughters of Tzlofchad came close. Kevan shesham'u benot Tzlofchad. When the daughters of Tzlofchad heard, Sheha'aretz mitchaleket lashvatim v'lo lenekevot, that the land of Israel was due to be divided among the men and not among the women, nitkabtzu kulan zo al zo litol etza. They got together to take counsel. Amru, they said, lo kirachamei basar vadam rachamei hamakom. God's mercy is not like the mercy of human beings. Basar vadam rachamav al hazcharim yoter mina nekevot. Human beings take more mercy upon men than upon women. Aval mi she'amar v'haya ha'olam, but the one who created the world, that is God, eino kain, is not this way. Ela al hazcharim v'al hanekevot rachamav al hakol. God's mercy is on both men and women. Shene'amar, as it says, Tov Hashem lakol v'rachamav al kol ma'asav. God is good to all, and God's mercy is upon all of God's handiwork. This is a remarkable text in that the way the rabbis understand the gumption that led the daughters of Tzlofchad to be able to ask for something that was not written into their canon. Men were supposed to inherit and women were not. Was their sense of conviction that God approves of this, that God really wants something that human beings can't possibly see. This is incredibly bold. It's bold insofar as, how do they know? How do they know? It's bold insofar as what are the limits of deciding what it is that you think God wants to see versus what's actually canonized in your customs and your laws. It's bold insofar as essentially for a person looking at this today and thinking about what feminism means through a theological frame, it essentially bids us to assert that feminism, like so many other important ideological advances of human beings over the last few centuries and the last many centuries, is actually in some ways a revelation of the divine will itself. This is radical, and this is some of the way that people have responded to Judaism and Me Too. If we look in number 4 on your source sheet, my colleague Michal Biton, in writing And He Shall Rule Over You, the Genesis of Me Too, is trying to understand the relationship between Genesis 1, Breshit Perek Aleph, in which human beings, man and woman, are created together in one body, and Breshit Perek 2, Genesis chapter 2, in which man is created and woman essentially is made of his rib in order to come to him. Moreover, the punishment of woman of actually becoming subservient to man. And she writes, let me explain. I read Genesis 1 as told from the point of view of God. How God created the universe and humanity. In Genesis 2, however, God describes the same event, but from an anthropological, that is human, point of view. Dibra Torah kilshon b'nei Adam. The Torah presents a human point of view in which the original creation narrative is transformed from one in which men and women are equal to one in which men have dominion over women. In Genesis 2, God describes the way that men experienced and interpreted Genesis 1. It is all about human creation, about our social construction of gender, society, and human culture. This approach, as I just mentioned, is an approach that seeks to, I would say in quotes, rescue the divine, in a sense of saying it can't be that God is complicit, even in our sacred canon, it can't be that God is complicit in the flaws of human beings and inequity. Similar to the way that people have spoken about the abolition of slavery and the fact that it is mentioned in our Torah, the idea here is that God can see the long horizon and the long view. But human beings, it takes us a long time to actually get there. The second approach, Midrash. The person to read on Midrash and understanding rabbinic homiletics and what it's trying to do is absolutely David Stern. The way that he presents, an academic at University of Pennsylvania, the way that he presents what Midrash is about is exactly, it really captures what people who are trying to use the Midrashic mode of dealing with male privilege in Jewish tradition are trying to do. In number 6, he describes the object of Midrash, was not so much to find the meaning of Scripture. And I'm going to add parenthetically, after all, you can find midrash, you can find rabbinic homiletics that will tell you that certain characters in the Bible had tails. The rabbis don't really mean that they had a tail. They're trying to get at something else. Continuing with what he says, it's not so much to find the meaning of Scripture as it was literally to engage its text. Midrash became a kind of conversation the rabbis invented in order to enable God to speak to them from between the lines of Scripture, in the textual fissures and discontinuity that exegesis discovers. The multiplication of interpretations in Midrash was one way, as it were, to prolong this conversation. He's not speaking here about legal Midrash. He's speaking here about what we call Aggadic Midrash, story, the way in which the rabbis took the verses and amplified them, created entire stories out of the gaps in the text, turned things upside down in order to continue the conversation, to prolong the conversation. The Midrashic move in terms of understanding how to respond to male privilege in the Jewish canon essentially posits, wait a second, we can reappropriate some of this conversation to include women's voices and women's perspective. As I mentioned, was a danger with our first approach in terms of understanding what it is that God actually wants and what the limits are there. In the Midrashic approach, what I find interesting and slightly confounding is that you can really use the Midrashic approach to completely upend the very literal meaning of the text, and you can equally use the Midrashic approach in order to offer a new and compelling reading of the literal reading of the text in order to maintain it. And these both are using the same strategy. I'd like to share an example of each for a moment. If you take a look at number 7, Shani Leibovitz is reading the story of Miriam's, Miriam's really uncomfortable, tense moment with God, in which Miriam has told calumny about her brother Moses, and as a result, God has made Miriam into a leper. She literally takes the plain reading of the text, in which the reading of the text is, and God was angry at Miriam and Aaron who had spoken together. And Miriam became white like snow in her leprosy. And God said to Moses, her father has spit in her face. Should she not go and be in solitude for 7 days? And she is kicked out of the camp for 7 days before everyone can move on. She literally takes this literal meaning and turns it on its head in a midrashic form in number 7. The Hebrew word for anger, she says, and sparked, vayichar af, can also mean linger and glow. Perhaps God wasn't angry at all. Rather, God's glow lingered as a lover who had just heard the song of the soul of their beloved. Miriam was overtaken in spiritual epiphany, and her skin became white as snow because she had just seen and touched the likeness of God and felt overwhelmed. Feel the complete reversal that this midrash is offering to the plain meaning of the text. God is angry at Miriam, and so she becomes leprous. The way that Leibovitz reads this, there is an ecstatic moment in which Miriam can feel a certain presence of God that turns her overwhelmed and white. Some say that in Numbers 12:14, God says to Moses, if Miriam's father were to have certainly spit in her face, she would have hidden the embarrassment for 7 days. Take another look at the Hebrew, she says. The root letters Yud, Resh, Kuf, to spit, could also mean a green plant, a bud that flourishes within itself. And the word for she would have hidden, tikalem, can also be translated from the roots kaf lamed lamed, she will complete. With this new understanding, we could read Numbers 12:13 as God said to Moses, I will bring the bud that flourishes within her to completeness with 7 days. She will retreat outside the camp and she will rejoin you. Now, some of you listening to this midrash are saying, I don't buy it. It's too much of a reversal. Others of you listening to the midrash are saying, thank you for rescuing this moment for me. It's remarkable. The very same strategy can elicit those two perspectives. And now on to the Me Too moment. Something that I noticed in one of the many Jewish responses to Me Too was a different kind of use of Midrash by Avital Chizik-Goldschmidt, the journalist. She uses Midrash to try to uphold certain practices as opposed to upending them in number 8. She's speaking here about the Jewish law of yichud, of not having one man and one woman be in seclusion together. And in fact, it isn't only about one man and one woman, it's about one man and a number of women. She writes, these laws in number 8 were probably rooted in a Talmudic view of women as objects of temptation, laws intended to protect men from sin as much as women from assault, in a time when a woman's purity and thus honor were everything. This explains why the classic details of the laws actually may not prevent assault. For example, according to Yichud, 2 men may be alone with 1 woman, or for that matter, 2 men may be alone together. But what if instead of dismissing these laws as irrelevant or misogynist, we read them as mandating personal space? Perhaps it is time to reclaim them as acknowledgement of the darkest corners of the human sexual psyche and how they affect our social interactions, something that many Americans today recognize and that most school and university policies about private student educator meetings are beginning to reflect. Whatever its original reasoning may have been, Yichud today has the potential to serve as a powerful tool for women to cope with the realities of a Weinstein world. Demand that others be present. Protect your personal space. Some of you watching and listening to that Midrash will say, I'm not convinced by that at all. That's a completely far-fetched reading of a practice that's been upheld for a long time in order to continue that practice. Others of you watching this will say, thank you so much. You've just rescued that practice, which I consider binding, and this gives me a way to understand it in an empowered version. The same tool, opposite effects, opposite reactions. And to me, the question of Midrash and how it's used in the Midrashic approach, it implicates questions of submission, it implicates questions of authority, and the questions of really how far can you take it? On the one hand, it notes the elasticity of the text. It notes the ability to create worlds within the gaps in the text, and even to be able to find layers and layers and layers of what the Torah is actually teaching us. But the questions that it's always going to leave us with is, what's your ultimate goal? What's your ultimate motivation? Are you recognizing the text as an authority and therefore trying to find a way into it? Are you subverting the authority of the text? How are different people going to feel about that use and what it actually says regarding the plain meaning and the original intention of this text and how it layers on or how it might seem to contradict? The Midrashic approach. Getting to our third approach, it's very simple. You can find schools all over the country named after Jewish women who were the exception to the rule of male privilege. You can find little Jewish girls named after Jewish women who were the exception to male privilege. This approach, this precedent approach, which I offer, I think really comes from a legal frame where you're trying to find what is it that I can retrieve here and say, this belongs in here. And we can have many more examples that follow this particular model. And there are lots of them. They're all over the place, which is a beautiful thing. There's Miriam, there's Devorah, there's Bruria, there's Yalta, there's the Kabbalistic versions of the feminine Godhead. There's so much that we can understand. There's our foremothers. There's so much that we can use. My question about this approach is really the question of whether it reifies the exception. What if I'm not a Bruria? What if I can't model myself after her? What if I'm never going to reach that level? So who are my just regular, average, run-of-the-mill heroes who I can seek to be like? And that's where I wonder if the precedent approach in some ways doesn't keep us in this conversation of, well, the default is masculine, but there will always be those women who stand out, as opposed to saying the default is everyone. And that brings us to our fourth approach, redefining categories. Now, redefining categories is sticky because I promised you that we were going to be speaking from the perspective of a reader and not the perspective of how you enact your Judaism. Certainly the conversation about redefining categories in the way that people live their Jewish lives, that what applied to men now apply to women. Many Jewish communities actually live this. I want to speak to people who live this and who don't live this, and the way in which they understand the Torah as speaking or not speaking to them. Elana Stein Hain, I think this has become in some ways her book, If All the Seas Were Ink, a memoir. This has become in some ways a calling card for what it means to be someone who is engaged in Torah study and deeply engaged in modern life. Reading her book as she essentially uses her study of the Talmud as a memoir for her life is really a remarkable synthesis between a human being's experience and a human being's faith and how they fit together. And Elana writes in her introduction to the section of Talmud that is about women per se, she writes in number 10, "As a modern woman reader of Talmud, I was fascinated by the rabbi's assumptions about women's attitude towards marriage and children, and I wondered whether they still resonate with women today. After my divorce," she writes, "I thought about whether it is still true, as the rabbis insist, that tav lameitav tandu milameitav armelu, that a woman would prefer to be married than to be alone, even if, as the rabbis go on to assert, her husband is the size of an ant. Does this principle hold in an age when, at least in many parts of the world, women can own property, live independently, and have children out of wedlock with undue social sanction?" And here you can see and you can feel that she's blending not only readership, she's also blending what should the rules be today. But I want to focus on the readership element. "It soon became clear to me that by the Talmud standards, I am a man rather than a woman. If man is defined as an independent, self-sufficient adult, whereas woman is a dependent, generally living in either her father's or her husband's home. In some ways, this was a relief, because I could regard the Talmud's gender stereotypes as historical curiosities rather than infuriating provocations. I would add again in parentheses that if your courts still rule that way, I'm not sure that that equally applies. The Talmud did not offend me," she writes, "because I was defying its classification through my very engagement with the text. So many of the classical interpretations of the Talmud reflected gendered assumptions, and these texts have the potential to take on radically new meaning when regarded through feminine eyes. Though plowed through by generations of scholars before me, the Talmud was fertile ground for gleaning new insights and fresh perspectives." What's remarkable about this perspective, in my opinion, is that she isn't simply talking about if the Torah's original audience, even for things that seem completely gender neutral, was male. Today, it can also be female. She's also saying that the female learner adds deeper layers of understanding and different layers of understanding to the text that she is now able to read and learn and feel addressed by. This is a remarkable contribution. But as with each, I'm going to have to problematize it. I'm going to have to problematize it in two senses. Number one, even if a woman is now able to consider herself the audience of the Torah is still by and large, and I mean by this both the Bible and rabbinic tradition, the Torah is still by and large not going to reflect her experience. She has to bring her experience to bear. And the second goes back to the conversation about authority, because not every reader is going to be able to understand what it means to be addressed by the Torah in the very same way. For some, being addressed by the Torah means that you can add your insights, but the authority still rests in the text itself. And how to negotiate that is going to differ community to community and person to person. What we've tried to present here is the beginning of a conversation. The beginning of a conversation for those who consider Torah as central, for those for whom Jewish texts and the Jewish canon should have a shaping effect and a shaping impact and relevance in life, how we can understand without simply affirming nor with rejecting the male privilege that is inscribed in Torah, how we can actually grapple with it, how we can talk about it, how we can be explicit about this gap, and how we try to mind it. What I've tried to do is be thoroughly intellectually honest. Thoroughly intellectually honest, both in asserting that as a person of faith who believes the Torah should shape the way that I think of the world, that there are things that are difficult for me to understand and they're difficult for me to accept at face value. And also totally intellectually honest at noticing that each and every one of these responses, each and every one of these strategies is going to have big questions attached to it and is going to have challenges attached to it. So before we get to the Q&A, I want to leave you with 3 points. Number 1, I think it's really important that we are explicit about the ways in which we are thinking about this question of male privilege in the canon. That we do not rely on our students to ask us, well, what did Dina think? But that we proactively talk to them about the importance of bringing Dina's voice into the room. That we not wait for a Me Too moment in order to recognize that we need more women's voices in the teaching of Torah, and that it's always been the way that men have dominated the conversation, but that we proactively do something about it. That's number 1. Number 2, I would say on a very personal note, when I think about these challenges, and I think about the reasons that I decide to be in the camp of reinterpretation, as opposed to the camp of rejection, and as opposed to the camp of affirmation, what I think about is really, what do I consider to be the point of all of this? What's the point of Torah? What's the point of the Bible? What's the point of rabbinic tradition? And being somebody who sincerely believes in the goals of the Bible and the goals of rabbinic tradition, that is the goals of bringing humanity closer to God, that is the goals to bringing humanity to their best selves, that is the goal to bringing the Jewish people to represent something divine in this world, that I'm willing to confront these challenges. I'm willing to stay in this conversation because I really believe in the text that I'm talking to. And the third, I would say, is something that's a more general point. It's not that I'm trying to say, well, everything has been male-dominated forever, so what's the difference here? I'm not trying to say that. The reason I'm not trying to say that is because I expect more from a system that is sacred, a system that has divine roots, that has divine origins, and humanity at its best. But I think it is really important to note that if we want to hold on to a past and live that past into its future, we have to confront this question in every single discipline. Everything was dominated by male privilege forever. And so if we're really dedicated to stringing the past into the future, then we need to confront these questions as individuals, as communities, as educators, and as learners. Thank you very much. We're going to open it up to some question and answer. I'm going to invite my colleague, Rabbi Sarah Mulhern, to join me back here at the table.
Thank you, Elana, for that beautiful and provocative presentation. We received a large number of questions, so we'll highlight a few for you to address at this time. So first, I want to ask 2 questions together, which both seek to interrogate some of your fundamental assumptions. Michael Reuven of Cambridge, Massachusetts writes, to what extent, if at all, is it problematic to teach a Jewish studies curriculum based exclusively on primary texts from the canon, written by men, for men, as you said, in the first place? What is gained and what is lost by including or focusing on secondary literature written by women for the sake of gender balance? On a similar approach, David Morris of New York City, New York, wrote, is this an issue on which Jewish sources have something unique to say? Even if you could separate the Jewish values on this issue from the historically anthrocentric approach of the texts, why is it legitimate or even valuable to do so?
Okay, I love these questions. I love these questions. I love these questions. Okay, we're going to start with the first one, and I'm actually going to pick the 2 apart a little bit. Great. We're going to start with the first one because this actually happened. I was giving a class on love, hatred, and loyalty, and I quoted I quoted Martha Nussbaum, a contemporary philosopher, to explain the neo-Aristotelian understanding of love. Somebody came up to me afterwards, and he said, "You're in a shiur context. You're in a Torah teaching context. Why didn't you cite Maimonides?" I mean, Maimonides was neo-Aristotelian on this. Why did you cite Martha Nussbaum? So I actually thought a lot about it, and what I realized is that I need to cite both. And I think that being able to cite both and be able to show some of the continuities and some of the discontinuities is really important. As I always say, and you might catch me in a lie if I ever don't do this, I really try to make sure that I have a woman's voice on every source sheet that I provide. And that is not because I finish my source sheet and then I try to find a woman. It's because I am reading women's voices on Torah all the time. In terms of that second question, does Judaism have anything unique to say? Okay, let's be honest here. If you're somebody who believes that, Jewish law is binding, then you want to know what Jewish law has to say about this. You want to know how Jewish law implicates men. You want to know how Jewish law implicates women. So you want to talk about it. If you believe that Judaism is full of big ideas, even if you don't find it binding, then you're thinking about, well, I'm interested. I'm a Jew, let's say, or I'm a person who's interested in religion. By the way, I'm sure there are many people watching this who are not Jewish, but they're interested in religion, right? Then you might say, I'm interested in specifically what a religious tradition has to say. So it might be about personal identity. It might be about religion. What does religion have to add to the conversation? I have to say, I don't need the response to Me Too to be Jewish. I keep these sort of separate in my own mind in the sense that I want Me Too to be responded to by people taking actions to make sure that people don't get harassed in the workplace or anywhere else, men, women, or anyone else for that matter. I also, as a Jew, as a learner of Torah, I want to be able to know what my tradition says about it because I care what my tradition says about it, not because I think that the Torah anticipates Me Too in a way in which a person making HR conversation. The culture was completely different. So that's the way I would put it, meaning they're all important to me, but they don't have to be a Venn diagram. The reason we're doing this project is because I think what we're trying to say is we need to work on Me Too. We're going to work on that. We need to think about gender dynamics within the Jewish world. Let's think about that through a Jewish lens because we're thinking about gender dynamics through a Jewish world, through a Jewish lens. So when you listen to Paul Nachme's talk on masculinity, where he's talking about the 19th century yeshiva of Volozhin, where he's talking about yeshiva boys studying Talmud, and he's saying this is how we can create the new man, that's a remarkable contribution. Or you listen to Ariel Levita saying, let's talk about Chava, Eve, and Lilith, and the monstrous feminine in Jewish tradition, and let's have a conversation. It's because we're trying to talk about the Jewish community. It's not because, I'm going to bring you a text that's going to solve everything for the Me Too moment. I'm not, and I shouldn't, and that would be wrong, and I think a misappropriation of the tradition, I would add. So my short answer to your short question.
So given that, you may want to reject the next set of questions because acknowledging that the project of the Created Equal team is in that second category. We did receive a large number of questions really pushing in the first category and wanting to know what Elana Stein Hain has to say about how, on a more practical level, more applicability level, the Jewish community can move forward on these issues. So a few examples. Carol Weiner from New York City says, how do we begin actually doing this in the Jewish communal world and the larger Jewish community? Respect, equal pay, benefits for women, they all feel so far away. Deborah Nussbaum-Cohen of Brooklyn wrote, what do you think are our first steps as we shift both Jewish and secular culture away from male privilege? So I wonder if you want to respond in any piece of that.
Well, here's what I would say. I think that everybody has their own audience. Everybody has their own concentric circle of influence. And in your concentric circle of influence, people are motivated and feel compelled by different kinds of discourse. So for example, if you are in an HR environment, you have to figure out what is going to be the most practical and compelling way to start a conversation about this. Is it by imposing certain sanctions if things are done wrong? Is it by having a company-wide discussion? Is it by lobbying Congress? Meaning that's one conversation. The places where we're having conversations, we're asking the questions of Jewish leaders, how do you want to live by the best Jewish values you can? And because we're doing that, what we want to do in this created equal curriculum, and it's not really a curriculum, it's a set of conversations. What we want to do in this set of conversations is we want to say, let's look at Jewish tradition for what it has to say about change, about leadership, about ethical quandaries, recognizing, and this is why in some ways this discussion that we're having today is prior to all of that, because we have to recognize that, yes, we do have a very gender imbalanced canon. And in order to be able to honestly come and say, look, we're not going to sit here and talk about how gender maps on exactly to 2017. That's not what we're going to do. We're going to mind Jewish tradition in the Created Equal team. We're going to mind Jewish tradition for what it has to say in general about how you make change around ethical issues, not specifically gender. But it would be wrong / I think it would impede progress not to be able to say, friends, when we learn these texts, we have to make sure that women are represented in some way. And those are two separate parts of the project. I mentioned at the beginning that the part of the reason why I think this is so important is because I will continue to teach my children Parsha every week. I will continue to teach them Torah each and every week. And I hope that what I teach them in Parsha will actually really impact the way they think about the world. Now, if I'm teaching them Parsha every week and all they hear about is men, 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 men in the way that I tell it, well, then I'm impacting them. And so this conversation about being explicit about the gap and having strategies to confront it as opposed to hiding from it because we're afraid of what it'll do I mean, to my mind, this will make people more interested in having the conversation because you're being transparent, you're being honest. You're not pretending that something is simple when it isn't. And this is everything from the past moving into the future. There are no simple answers.
It's interesting you bring the example of teaching Parsha to your sons, because a number of people actually also asked about this question of education, as you're an educator, and children, and when to begin to introduce some of these questions of the problematics of the male voice of the tradition, when and how to frame that for younger learners.
So I think this is, given that I do not teach in a school context, and my experience through this is through, like guest classes for kids or through my own kids, this is a question for educators in K through 8, in 9 through 12. This is a question for educators on college campus, because I think you can ask the exact same question about anything that relates to problematics, right? When do you introduce problematics? I have a different question, which is, forget about problematics. When do you start introducing female voices, right? Meaning, somebody told me, a high school educator told me recently, she said, or previously a high school educator, she said, when we learn about the story of the rape of Dinah, I had my students do a project, and this is in Genesis, for those who are watching who are not as familiar, I had my students do a project writing Dinah's perspective. What do you think Dinah thought in that moment? Not because the text said it, not because they thought it was authoritative once they did it, but because she wanted her students to recognize that there's another piece of the story which, for whatever reason, is not captured there. And that's not saying anything about problematics. Yes, a student might raise her hand and say, well, why isn't that in the text to begin with? And then for that student, that could be a conversation, but it doesn't have to be in the sense of problematics. And I would add, I approach this topic with such trepidation, because I know that there are people watching for whom opening this can of worms itself is an act of sacrilege, that it is problematic to open this can of worms. And my perspective is, it really depends on where you are. For some people, it is so essential to open this can of worms for them to be able to feel a sense of commitment and belonging in a religious tradition, in a Jewish culture, right? Like in Jewish text, right? Regardless of your religious orientation or your not religious orientation towards this. But for some people, it can be incredibly destabilizing and it can be highly problematic. And I think it's a question for educators that I hope people will be taking up and continuing to think about, especially in this Me Too moment. And I kind of know that people already are. And for those watching who are in that bucket, we're looking to you for your leadership. We really, really are.
So as we talk about leadership, and the role of Jewish communal leaders and educators, there's a very interesting question that we received from Jonathan Freirich of Buffalo, New York, about the idea of hierarchy in the first place. So he writes as follows: Are all hierarchies bad? Is it possible to utilize the privileges of authority to alleviate oppression? How do we appropriately take on the responsibilities of authority or privilege if we have it? Can we use our power in a hierarchical system to establish and maintain an egalitarian society? How do we exercise power for good without abusing it? So it's a big question, but one I think really is fundamental to this whole discussion. So I hope you'll address it.
Okay, so let's be honest. Jewish tradition is built on hierarchy. We have a God who is above the whole program, right? We have leaders who came in the form of a Moses, who came in the form of a Devorah, who came, right? We have leaders. We have a rabbinic tradition that speaks in hierarchical terms. We have priests, Levites, and Israelites. I am often reminded of my very plebeian status of being a mere Israelite, not from the priestly line by anyone who somehow can trace themselves to a priestly line. Now, that said, I think the question is about how you allow different perspectives to be represented. What I'm dealing with here, very simply, is the fact that women's voices are not represented. It would be like describing the entire temple cult ritual only from the perspective of the high priest and not from the perspective of anybody else, when that is something that actually really informed the lives of everyone. I want to know what the person who didn't make it to Jerusalem for that temple worship is thinking about and doing in their house, right? In some ways, this is history from below. So I would start with that very basic point. To my mind, and I'm very idiosyncratic about this, and I recognize that, and you and I argue about this all the time. And many people argue about this, and rightly so. The step that I'm talking about is simply representing people's perspectives. It's that simple. Just start with that. Where you want to go with hierarchy, dismantling, this, I don't know. That's going to depend on what your notions of authority are and how you interpret the Jewish text and Jewish tradition and what's binding and what's not binding. Everybody's going to have their own opinion on that. I'm going to have my own opinion on that, and somebody else is going to have their own opinion on that. But I think there's something that anyone who's in that middle category of reinterpretation can understand, which is we want women's perspective. We want women's scholarship. We want women's voices. We want women's wisdom. Not because they're women, because they're people.
So as you raise up this question of voice, we also heard from a number of people who looked at the contemporary cultural moment and saw a movement towards privileging the voices of people who have been previously marginalized and quieting the voices of people who have been previously less marginalized or empowered. Different kinds of reactions to that. But a question that emerges from that is where are men's voices in this conversation? What is the role of Jewish men in this conversation? Is it to take a step back and allow women's voices to come forward, or are there active contributions that Jewish men can be making in this work?
I love that so much also. It's such I think that's a very challenging question because on the one hand, it seems like there is this sense of, oh, thank goodness this can of worms has been opened. Like we're finally talking about what happens to women, all kinds of aggressions, and women get to finally say what they've felt and experienced, and that is great. And you want to let that out. What you don't want to do is you don't want men to think they don't belong in the room for that conversation. Of course they belong in the room. The zero-sum game mentality, right? That is actually what we have experienced throughout human history, which is somebody's up, somebody's down. How can we actually, partnership. How can we create more of a partnership conversation? You know, another approach to male privilege in Jewish tradition for the Me Too moment is men asking themselves, well, what does Jewish tradition require of me as a Jewish man? What does it mean to be a Jewish man? And to be honest, I don't think we talk about that enough. Nearly enough about masculinity in general and about Jewish masculinity in particular, which is why I'm glad that Paul is going to be releasing his web video on detoxing masculinity from a Jewish perspective. So I definitely think men belong in the conversation. I think what we need to watch out for in general are voices trying to overshadow each other. So we don't want all the women's voices overshadowing the men's voices, and we don't want the men's voices overshadowing the women's voices. And sometimes that means that people need to take turns talking. So this might be a moment where women have to just talk, and women have to just share what's going on, and men have to listen. And then we might come to a place where there can be more conversation. People could disagree with me. Maybe 600 people just disagreed with me. I have no idea. But it is my feeling that there is no one way to create this sense of balance and partnership. It doesn't necessarily mean that we can all talk at once, and it doesn't necessarily mean that the sequences are exactly perfect. It's messy, but if we're in this for the long haul, what we'll recognize is we need to do something that raises all ships, not simply that puts people in the spotlight that haven't been in the spotlight before. That's a start, but you need partnership, you need conversation, you need dialogue. And I think, we saw some of that mirrored recently at our conference, at our small convening on power and privilege, where men and women were in the room discussing this, and there were points at which men said that they felt like outsiders to the conversation, and then there were other points at which they said, I'm so glad I felt like an outsider to the conversation because I learned things that I never would have known before. So we all need to think about this question, which is not a way of punting, but a way of keeping the question open.
It's a great question and a great answer. I want to end with just a final question about your focus on reading in particular versus possibly bringing this conversation to other realms of Jewish life. We got a number of questions about, for example, Francine Dick from Ontario wrote, if women are not full spiritual participants in the realm of Jewish practice, can they ever be seen as equals in Jewish communal contexts and in the intellectual tradition? So I wonder if you just have a few sentences to add about the implications of this conversation about reading and textuality for other areas of Jewish life, whether that be ritual practice or Jewish communal leadership or even sociology.
Sure. So I would say that feminism is within a constellation of values for me personally. And in that constellation also comes commandedness, in that constellation also comes authority, in that constellation also comes tradition. And so when I think about these questions, I'm much more comfortable thinking about these questions as a reader than as an actor, because I don't actually know the answer to her question. Meaning, I don't actually know if women can ever be considered equals if men and women are not doing the exact same thing in a ritual context. But to me, that's not the only question. Meaning, to me, the question is also, what does tradition have set out for men and women to be doing and how they should be acting? And I'm learning to navigate that myself as I continue to get older and as I continue to raise children. And what I realize is that everybody's going to have a different answer to that question, because those questions of authority and commandedness and change and evolution, people answer them differently. And I would be intellectually dishonest if I said to Francine, was it Francine? Francine, I think that was you. I would be intellectually dishonest if I said, oh no, yeah, separate is equal, separate is equal, separate is equal. We learned in this country that separate is not equal, right? That was something that we learned in grade school. We learned that. And I can't deny that. But what I can say is I'm bound by the way that I understand tradition and the way that tradition has understood the limits and possibilities for men and women, and people feel bound or not bound by that in different ways. So that's certainly provocative, I hope.
So I want to end by saying that we just asked you a lot of questions, and I wonder if you can just leave us with what's the one question that all of us who have been learning from you and with you today should take with us.
Great. The question that I would leave people with, what are you going to do to include more women's voices in the Torah conversation and in religious conversation in general? What are you going to do? Because each of us is ambassadors in making this a more beautiful, a more compelling, a more exciting tradition to be a part of. Thanks so much for joining.
Thank you.